Hiya. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't mind, before we start the next session, we're going to present a quick IS prize in conjunction with UNAIDS. The Women, Girls, and HIV Investigators Prize will be presented by Ms. Jan Beagle, Deputy Executive Director of UNAIDS, along with Princess Tessie of Luxembourg.
Good afternoon. Princess Tessie and I are very pleased to join you this afternoon to present the Women, Girls, and HIV Investigators Prize. UNAIDS is proud to partner with the International AIDS Society, the International Centre for Research on Women, and the international community of women living with HIV/AIDS in awarding this prize. Established in 2006, the prize seeks to encourage research in low and middle-income countries that can benefit women and girls affected by HIV and AIDS. And we know that women and girls are a key affected population, especially in this region. Yet, despite this vulnerability, women are underrepresented in HIV research. We are hoping that this prize will help to raise awareness and commitment to assure that research data is disaggregated by sex and presents greater opportunities for gender-based analysis. And this is important because despite wide-ranging commitments to gender equality, including in the Sustainable Development Goals and in the Political Declaration on HIV/AIDS, women and girls are still not adequately represented in clinical trials. Sex and gender differences tend to go unanalyzed and unreported. Without better sex disaggregated data and reporting that is gender sensitive, we will fail in addressing the needs of women and girls. And as Professor Slim said at the end of that last session, we need all the evidence we can to impact on the major challenge of HIV in young women. We're joined today by Princess Tessie. She is a UNAIDS advocate for young people's and women's access to health and for eliminating gender inequality. She's also interested in using her previous experience in humanitarian work to address AIDS in emergency contexts. She will share more about the award and this year's winner. Princess Tessie.
Thank you so much. Your Royal Highness Prince Africa Zulu of Ongweni, Excellencies, Ministers, activists, advocates, innovators, and change makers. I am humbled to be asked to present the award to the winner of the Women, Girls, and HIV Investigators Prize. This award is supported by the International Centre for Research on Women and the international community of women living with HIV. Partnerships such as these are what the AIDS response has been built on and are critical to achieving the end of AIDS. Gender equality and women's empowerment are issues very close to my heart. As a UNAIDS global advocate for young women and adolescent girls, I am committed to promoting the gender, health, and social justice for women in all our wonderful diversity. At this point, I want to again acknowledge the amazing networks of women living with HIV and the women's rights movement who have been on the front lines of the HIV response and are fighting to ensure the delivery of more effective HIV and sexual and reproductive health services, including to address gender-based violence. Women bear the brunt of this epidemic, especially in this region. Their vulnerability goes far beyond the biological and incorporates social, economic, cultural, and structural factors. The theme of this conference, equity, access, rights now, incorporates the UNAIDS principle of leaving no one behind. Currently, women, especially young women and adolescent girls, are being left behind by the AIDS response. There are thousands of preventable new HIV infections among adolescent girls and young women every week. This is unacceptable. We desperately need research and innovation to find new and better ways to prevent HIV infection and HIV-related morbidity. Women living with HIV are 5 times more at risk of developing cervical cancer than HIV negative woman. More than 250,000 women die each year from cervical cancer, 85% of whom come from low and middle income countries. This $2,000 prize is awarded to an investigator, regardless of gender, from a low or middle income country whose abstract demonstrate excellence in research that addresses women, girls, and gender issues related to HIV. Women who are part of key affected populations have a high increased risk of contracting HIV. Today's abstract contributes to the body of research that tries to explain and understand how women's bodies are more susceptible to HIV. It is my very great honor to present the 2016 Woman, Girl, and HIV Investigators Prize to Sinaye Napu from South Africa for his abstract, Effect of Injectable Hormonal Contraceptives on Vaginal Epithelium Thickness and Genital HIV Target Cell Density in Women Recently Infected with HIV. Congratulations.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sisonkem Simang. I am here to facilitate and moderate this panel, which will really look at the policy and advocacy and programming implications of the session before. So for those of you who weren't here, the CAPRISA data is really important and in many ways very interesting. And helps us to understand a little bit more about what's happening with new infections amongst adolescent girls and young women in particular. So a very quick summary, and I will probably garble it given my non-medical background, but let me say quickly, clearly what's emerging is that this crucial bridge of transmission between older men and younger girls now has some very hard evidence. We've talked about it for a long time, we've known it for a long time, but I think it's giving us hard evidence about that. There's some new findings about Privitalibivir, and so we now know that if you have Privitalibivir, the likelihood of HIV infection is much higher than for women who don't have it. And then we also know that in terms of vaginal bacteria, there's some profound implications for the efficacy of tenofovir. So this has real significant implications for PrEP. So we've got this biomedical information, which is useful and helpful, but we also have long-standing advocacy and programs which are focused on the importance of doing real work around women's rights and human rights. So the question, I think, for this panel is, how do we bring those together, and how do we really move forward with the new evidence that we have, which confirms what we've already known in ways that are able to turn the tide. So I thank my fellow panelists. Those of you who have the program will know who is with us, so I won't go into long introductions. Look at our name tags, you will see who we are. For those of you who don't recognize faces, you will read and see. And I want to get us into a lively conversation that is not scripted, that doesn't involve PowerPoints, and that speaks to questions, yeah? And that seeks to engage one another. So if panelists are boring us with jargon or are speaking in ways that are too long, I will move them on quickly and ask us to respond to the real issues, because I think the issues are far too urgent for young women for us to dilly-dally with jargon. So let's keep it lively, let's keep it respectful, but I think most importantly, let's keep it on target and focus on what this data means in the lives of women and girls. So I'm going to kick off the discussion by asking Vuyiseka, who's sitting here to my immediate left, to talk about, based on your experiences as a young HIV-positive woman, maybe not so young anymore, HIV-positive woman, depends on the criteria you use for young, who lives and works in South Africa and was an instrumental part of Truth in Action campaign, which has talked to all of us so much about inequality. What do you make of this new evidence that we now have about transmission modes and routes and the biomedical science?
Thanks, Siswanke. I think with biomedical medicine, we're moving very fast, which is good in a way. But at the same time, we've learned that over the 16 years of the epidemic in South Africa, since it's known that it's not only biomedical interventions that will avert HIV infections amongst young girls. And I'm saying this with one example that I think probably will drive this point I'm trying to make home, is that I'm a mother of a 10-year-old whom I have used vertical elimination of HIV through PMTCT. Now Nina is about to be 10 years. I did my part to prevent her from HIV, but she will eventually get HIV because society and some of the gender-based violence challenges, structural challenges in society have not changed. So as much as we're moving very fast, we're now talking about, injectables, vaccines, we're talking about PrEP. There's a basket of preventative methods that are probably going to be available for young women, but will they be able to use them? Does the structure in society allow them to be able to fully enjoy their right to be young girls in a society that accepts that young women are equal to young boys? I don't think so. So we can no longer, therefore, only have interventions that addresses HIV at a biomedical level without addressing the other social structural issues.
Thanks, Vu. So, Francoise, I think Vuyiseka makes an important point about the structural issues. I think that as someone who sits at the global level working on women's rights issues, championing these questions within the UN system and in global spaces, it's appealing to funders and people implementing large programs to talk about what works, and biomedical programs work. So what do we then say about all this structural stuff that can be a little bit fuzzy, to be honest?
Yeah, thanks, Siswanke. We heard a lot about the vagina in the previous session, and I'm really glad, actually, about that. But I do think we also need to talk about the girls to which these vaginas are attached. And, yeah, and really zoom out into the relationships. And we heard Slims allude to that, the sexual relationships in which the girls are operating and what they're experiencing. And it's really great to have finally very, very solid evidence. It's like a detective story of how these young girls have been infected by older men. Now, there is no disputing what is going on. And what we know on our side, working with young girls at the community level, is that these sexual relationships between young girls and older men are characterized by a very significant imbalance of power. These young girls, of course, are in relationships which are characterized by very traditional gender norms, where they themselves are socialized to be demure, to do whatever it is that they need to do to keep their man, because their worth has been associated with having a man and keeping a man. And the man himself has been socialized as since he was a young boy, to be dominant, to score, to have multiple partners, to prove his masculinity through violence. And that's the context of the sexual relationships that these girls are operating in. And that, of course, also occasions early and unwanted pregnancy through the same sexual relationships, and a whole host of issues connected with sexual violence. So if we're going to unravel AIDS, we have to unravel gender norms. And we have to get at the power dynamics between girls and these men. We'll ask, how do we do that? And while some of the biomedical interventions can be useful, we need to get at this question of gender norms and power. And what has been proven to work for that is comprehensive sexuality education that addresses specifically gender and power. And we have good data on that. It's well documented that if you implement comprehensive sexuality education from a young age, you have to start at the 5 and 6 year old level, not 19. It's too late. So with 5 and 6 year olds, girls and boys, you can really start changing gender norms and teach girls, first of all, to see as worthy, a different life plan for themselves, worthy in their own right, and also to know their bodies and really assert themselves, and boys to reconstruct masculinity in a different way. That harassing girls is not the way to express masculinity, but really there's another way than violence and harassment. And with that, I think we can disrupt the cycle. And if we do that, we can disrupt the cycle of HIV, but unwanted and sexual violence, because all these things come together. And I hope we can convince and persuade and cajole donors here to really commit to supporting comprehensive sexuality education as part of the package of interventions, because I don't think we know we can't treat our way out of the epidemic. We're not going to prep our way out of the epidemic, but I think we can teach and mentor our way out of the epidemic.
Thanks, Françoise. So Mark, following up on that notion, I mean, since 2008, the Global Fund has had this a strategy on gender equality. Clearly, if you look at the proposals that began to come to the Global Fund, since 2008, lots of fantastic analysis on gender. So countries have known for a long time and been able to kind of diagnose the gender issue. I think what we haven't seen countries doing was putting in their proposals the activities and the budgets to match the analysis. And so I guess the question is, one, is that assumption I'm making an assumption? Is it backed up in your experience? Do you agree with that? And then secondly, what's going to change? What's your sense of what the Global Fund is going to be able to do given the overwhelming evidence we're now seeing?
So, thanks, and I might rephrase it a little bit because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the Global Fund functions. I mean, we're not a secretariat. It's actually people in the country that make all those decisions. And it's made by government and civil society coming together. So maybe we can step the lens back a little bit from what Françoise said to something which to me is just glaring. It's great to be here in Durban and KwaZulu-Natal for a couple of reasons. One, this is really where the world began to recognize the gross inequalities around availability of services. But KwaZulu-Natal is also the epicenter, as is Southern Africa, for the rates of HIV in adolescent girls and young women that are absolutely frightening. And with the growing rates of the population, as Deb often points out, and I really want to thank Ambassador Birks she's really put this issue on the table, as is Michelle Sidibe, and the DREAMS program is fantastic. But the reality is we have got to look at the data. Incidence has been flat for 5 years, and if you look beneath it at adolescent girls and young women and at the population growth in adolescent girls and young women, we are at, and we need to celebrate the success, but we are at risk of losing control of this epidemic in this part of the world, driven fundamentally by adolescent girls and young women, which is driven fundamentally by gender inequality. And we're all in favor of sexual education, and I hope we see more and more of it. And I've actually been encouraged by the African countries that are picking up sex education. But that's not going to solve it alone either. And I hope what we can do, and I hope this meeting can be the beginning of it, is put aside individual actions and say, in a country, let's not even think, there is no such thing as a global HIV epidemic. There's no such thing in most places as a national epidemic. We have micro-epidemics. In this province, you can go within 10 kilometers and you will see a fundamentally different epidemic. And if you can go 10 kilometers and see the rates of risk to young girl being 10 times higher in going literally 10 kilometers away from each other. So can we put aside biomedical versus structural versus prevention versus treatment, put all that aside and say, we have an epidemic. How do we stop that epidemic? What are the drivers of the epidemic? Who's at risk? Why? And what are the interventions that are likely to have an impact? Because if we don't act now, we're going to lose control of this epidemic. And there's data on sexual education. There's data on keeping girls in school, which are awfully impressive. Now, we've known for a long time that girls in and out of school, boys in and out of school have very different rates. But now we have actual studies that show if you proactively keep them in school, their rates will go down. Variable. We know gender-based violence programs can have an impact. We need a little bit of the art and not just the science, too, because we don't know how it all fits together. So we have to actually put together programs in every microepidemic with the different interventions that are likely to have an impact, and then follow it and see if we are, because we can actually track this stuff if we look at it closely. We have more data than we ever have. And I think Deb and UNAIDS have done a remarkable job in driving us to get the data, and countries are getting the data. So my big plea, whether it's adolescent girls and young women or the LGBTI, is let's stop talking about it as if we have this or that silver bullet, or this or that thing that we all need to create a narrative around and jump behind and throw us all off course for a long time and say, what is the epidemic here? In this place we are? What is the microepidemic, and what are the components across the spectrum that we should try? You know, we call it throwing the kitchen sink at it, and then figure out if it's having an impact and adjust quickly. And adolescent girls and young women, it's keeping them in school. It's gender-based violence. It's dealing with sex education. It's recreating gender equality. And I will just end that way. This is not a medical issue. Gender inequality is not a medical issue. HIV is no longer really a medical disease. It's a societal disease, whether it's LGBTI or gender inequality. We will not end the HIV epidemic if we don't get gender equality right, if we don't empower women. Full stop. But more than that, we won't achieve any of the SDGs if we don't have a more gender equal world. So let's stop picking this or that and put it together in a coherent way to end this epidemic and actually create the world that we should be, which is an equal world, gender, LGBTI, all key populations. And then we'll end the epidemic, but we'll also be a better world.
Thanks, Mark. So I think that's an important set of interventions, and I'm going to turn it to Ambassador Brooks to kind of talk a little bit about a sort of basket approach, which looks both at biomedical interventions but also at structural and social changes. But just to make a point, because I think it is important to look at this issue holistically, but to also recognize where we come from, which is that for many, many years, women's rights organizations have had to wave the flag to say, please remember that there's a context in which this happens, that we've had to push and fight to make the points about structural inequality. And so I think part of where we need to be going as a recognition that all of it counts, but we're coming from a place where it hasn't always been the case, and we've had to fight to put that stake in the ground. So Ambassador Brooks, I'm going to ask you to speak to PEPFAR and this notion of a basket approach, and to the extent to which you agree with Mark's point about it not being an either or. What does that actually look like in the sort of programming?
Thank you. So we just stepped back a bit a couple of years ago, and I keep a finger in the microbicides of vaccine work just to keep an eye on what's actually happening with. Those are the studies that give us the incidence rates, so that really the infection rates among young women. And if you look at those infection rates of young women over the last decade in all of those studies, they remain fairly constant in the under 25 high-risk women. And so despite our best effort with the ABC approach, despite our best effort of sexual education curriculum, I'm not saying it was taught, curriculum, we didn't have the impact we wanted. And so we sort of did what Mark just talked about. Dreams is the kitchen sink. It is, but the kitchen sink chosen in the community about what kitchen sink they want. So we laid out about 25, 30 different options of known demonstrably positive interventions and said, you put together what you think is going to have an impact. We were not prescriptive. So there's community level elements, there's family level elements, there's adolescent girl specific elements. Only 5 countries so far have picked up PrEP, so there's 5 countries without a biomedical component. And it said those things together with a lot of M&E, can we impact the rate of new infection? And that is what DREAMS is about, determined, resilient, empowered, AIDS-free, mentored, and safe young women, recognizing each of those elements we believe are core to the structural barriers and some of the social issues of young women. But I think that also makes sure that we have to go back and look at every one of those elements. How much are the girls in school? Are they missing more school? Is sexual or sexuality education even being taught by the teachers? Do the people in the classroom find it relevant? Do we ever test to see if they understand what they've been taught? I mean, do they find this real to them? And I think those are the pieces we don't really have the data around. I love data, but this has to be the psychosocial data that we need to really see whether what we think we're doing is actually happening and relevant to the girl's life.
Thanks for that. It strikes me as you speak, and I'm going to ask Nduku to speak a little bit to this point. It strikes me as you speak that perhaps the architecture of getting the stuff done that isn't simply, that isn't about rolling out a program, but is the curriculum on sexual education being taught, not just that the curriculum is developed, but the difficult stuff of having a champion and a leader in a school who will make sure that it is taught, that stuff is political. And again, that's the stuff that community groups, women's rights organizations, with a feminist orientation have always done, right? So the question is, do those groups get the support? Because they're not the Beltway bandits. They're not necessarily doing the counting of the beans and the monitoring in that way. So does what they do count, and are they eligible for the kind of resources that we think are required to do this? I'm going to throw it back and ask you that, sorry, Ambassador Birks, and then I'll go to Nduku and ask her a follow-up.
Great, so thank you. We asked ourselves that same question 18 months ago when we saw the packet that everyone had wanted to do in DREAMS, and we looked at the expertise of the implementers, and they're superb, but they were missing some of the pieces you just described, and that's what the $85 million DREAMS Innovation Challenge was all about, is bringing those groups to the forefront, but also bringing, not only saying we see the adolescent, but that we hear the adolescent, and we believe that young women-led programs will have also an impact. Because peer educators within the school system that are champions for these issues not only will have that impact in the school system, but they will have that impact in their own lives and in that broader community. But I think the other point that you made is so critical. You know, we can have the biomedical data and superb research, and we could have community groups and advocacy. But if we don't have the political leadership, the leadership that says these kind of cultural practices are unacceptable and will be prosecuted. If we have the political leadership that says to the Ministry of Education, this is the curriculum and we're coming and you won't know we're there and we're checking in the classroom to see if this is being taught and how it's being taught and if it's being taught in an empowering way. That's the piece that we have to make sure we have for each one of these elements.
So Nduku, you run Kenya AIDS program. So you're in a position of understanding the epi stuff and having to think biomedical, but also understanding structural. So how do you do it? You're where the rubber hits the road, in a sense, right? So can you talk us through how you scale up empowerment programs and how you scale up the biomedical, how it comes together, and how you deal with this last piece that Ambassador Birks has just pointed out, which is the political, tricky, difficult stuff?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, but thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think I'll start by saying that it's pretty much the same way we have continued to have, this is biomedical, this is structural, so I don't think it is, you're doing political and structural and biomedical on different parts. I think it's really a lot, you're saying, what is it that we must do? So for instance, from Kenya, and one of the things that the National AIDS Control Council is responsible for is really ensuring that we have a multi-sector response. Now, I know that has become a cliche term, so the question is, what does it mean? And the way we have defined it is that it's being able to catalyze other sectors to deliver on goals for HIV prevention, care, and treatment. So you identify what you need from the other sectors, which ones they are, because you don't need something from every sector and not in the same ways, and then be able to move them. So let me speak about education and keeping girls in school. What we've been able to do, and we thank really the Global Fund because it provides the resources to work not just on the service delivery but outside, is to go to the Ministry of Education and say, you know, there are challenges with the curriculum and it needs to be reviewed. And once we started to have the conversation at the highest levels, you know, sort of a government agency to another government agency, what has happened was the Ministry of Education has been able to help and start a review as part of the national curriculum transformation that is looking at what is required and what is happening. But one of the biggest issues that nobody talks about was, even if we review the curriculum, the people we are asking to teach, even if you go and stand in that classroom, they do not have the skills, the capacity, because the information has not been passed, and neither do we even have we standardized how we want that information to be passed. Have we taught the teachers who are delivering the information? So we can do as much QA as we want, but if they do not have the capacity to do that, then it is not going to happen. So this year, within the context of our Global Fund funds, we have allocated resources to support in-service curriculum reviews so that teachers can know what to teach, because they are not just teachers, they are also parents, and they also want to be able to give this information out. It's not always people not wanting. The second sort of aspect to what you have asked, which is the question around being able to, how do you then mix all of the different pieces? The way I see it is you have various agencies. In our case, the NASCOP, which is a Ministry of Health unit that is responsible for service delivery, really is responsible for the biomedical service delivery. Our role is to be able to organize, coordinate what they are doing, what different partners are doing. And if we were able to say, okay, so what are the services that need to be offered that we can layer on? A specific example, we keep talking about the need for violence prevention because at the end of the day, everything we are talking about here is long-term. Attitude change is long-term. So what are the short-term gains, things that we can do now? And for violence prevention, there's a lot of data that we have on studies like image and other work that allows us to be able to integrate gender-based violence prevention into already existing programs for HIV. But we are not willing to do that. We are not willing to get our partners, implementing partners, and say, as you deliver your HIV services, because you're having contact with a person, with a young girl, you must be able to deliver this additional service. And until we do that, because those are short-term, quick gains that begin the conversation, we will forever be saying that we need to get to that place where we shall start attitude change. And that's another 10, 15, 20 years before we can see any measurable results. And if you'll allow me to make one last point, and it is the point of measurement, and I think Debbie referred to it, is the question of, as we do all of this, what are the indicators for prevention? What are the indicators for these goals that I'm looking at? What is not measured does not get done.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
So, Luis, in the spirit of what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, can you say a little bit about UNAIDS and the kind of guidance that we can expect to see coming out of UNAIDS around this really compelling evidence about what's happening with adolescent girls and young women?
UNAIDS is down. I think in terms of the guidance, I think we got a lot of elements. But very briefly, I think when science is playing, when you have 3 decades of knowledge, as is the case, I think what's becoming more and more important is access and implementation. And on that one, I have 3 points only that I think in a way, touched to the elements that brought by the other speakers. The first one, in terms of data, I would agree that we have a NOS, but I'm not sure if we have a NOS in terms of data coming from implementation science. We need to understand better what are really the barriers that are making access difficult, in that case by young women. We have some evidence, not on the women dimension, but in some key populations where discrimination in healthcare service is playing a major role in terms of a blockage to access. What's happening here in terms of access by young women, I think is a question that we may get more. A second point is in terms of the partnerships behind implementation. I think we do need to reflect, not only internationally, but of course in countries. When we have innovations like PrEP, HPV, and by the way, I didn't hear too much about HPV at the previous session, what's really the potential impact of rolling out HPV in young women. But when you have things like that, we need to rethink the way that we are going to roll out and to implement. And I think this discussion is still to happen. And the UNAIDS will be trying to convene this discussion as much as we can. And the third point that I think is probably the most important, at the political declaration in New York, where member states agreed a few weeks ago, one of the targets is 30% of the services delivered by communities and money behind for that. There is no discussion here. The evidence is clear. When communities play, you have better health outcomes. It's cheaper because it's closer to people. When you start to deal with people that are in difficult circumstances, that are being challenged by societies, like the case of the young women that we are talking here about, I think this is absolutely essential. And if we don't move in this direction, who is the urgent required? As Mark brought very clear to the table, and Deb and the others, it's not going to work.
Mark, I want to bring it back to you to ask you a question about the kind of overall funding context that we now find ourselves in. So obviously, as we all know, the Global Fund needs more funds. And in an environment like that, where we have to make choices that, a few years ago we didn't have to make, what are the chances that we can throw the kitchen sink at it? What are the chances that we can do all of the stuff? And if we can't, are we going to see countries putting in just trying to sustain treatment programs?
So it's the, billions of dollar question. PEPFAR needs more money, UNAID, everyone needs more money, and importantly, the countries need more money. The Global Fund certainly does. And more vehicles, all of us vehicles to get resources to the country. So, and it is interesting, again, to be here in Durban where things really started, and the Global Fund, and then PEPFAR, which grew and, has grown so big, has really changed things. But the reality is that 16 years ago, you could invest in pretty much anything and have impact, because there was so much need, so much death, so much that just needed to get started and done, that any money anywhere could make a difference. We're in a different world today, and it's largely been driven by the data. We also didn't have the data. I mean, the fact that in KwaZulu-Natal, we know the difference 10 kilometers away from each other in the risk to a girl is pretty extraordinary. We also know different interventions. And so what it really is how we spend money better and more effectively. So, and this is, I think, something Deb's done extremely well. We can't do these things because we're a financing mechanism and the decisions are made in the country. But if we focus where the new infections are, the way you end epidemics is not by doing the same thing everywhere. It's actually focusing where new infections are. And that means geographically, but also the populations. And, UNAIDS has their population location work, and Deb is really focused on this as well. We have to go where the new infections are, and that's where you stop epidemics. We need to treat people because that's the key piece for health for individuals, but we've got to go where new infections are and then use the interventions related to that epidemic. So if your epidemic is largely driven by adolescent girls and young women, which it is here, you will have a different series of interventions. If it's driven because you're close to a trucking route, you will have a different series of interventions. If it's driven because girls are so heavily out of school, it will have a different set of interventions. If you're in a community where it's people who inject drugs, which is your principal driver, you will have a different set of interventions. So what we have not done well yet is pivoting from, let's do everything everywhere, which is the full kitchen sink, to what is it in this place that will have the biggest impact. And then drive prices down where we can. So, we've been working, volume matters for this kind of stuff. In the last couple of years, working together with PEPFAR and different governments, including the South African government, we've collectively gotten the price of first-line therapy down by 25% in the last year alone. We've gotten the price in another disease of bed nets down by 40% in the last 3 years. There are things we can do much smarter. And then the second piece is governments increasing their contributions. And this is happening. We need to recognize that governments are, here in South Africa, even with PEPFAR's massive amount of money here, and we have a fair amount, it's still the government doing most of the work and most of the money. And so we have to increase those domestic finance tools as well. So I actually firmly believe that if we're smart, if we invest well, if we use the evidence and learn and monitor and switch in real time, not keep doing the same thing and then just adding, but switch in real time, we will have the resources and we will have the ability to end the epidemic. If we don't do that, we will have nice things happen and people will do well, but we're not going to get where we need to be. And it really gets back to, we can't keep picking out pieces of data and then spinning big narratives around a piece of data. We need to look at all the data and constantly reevaluate and constantly look and constantly modify. And if we do that, we still need more money. We absolutely need more money. But we will earn the money because we'll be able to show the impact. And when you show impact, you can get money. It's when you don't that you have a lot of trouble getting the money. I should have mentioned, I'm really sorry, but because this session changed, I'm going to have to leave. But a better person, Marika Vinrooks, is going to come and take any questions that might come up. She's been doing this stuff for a lot longer than I have. But thank you very much. And really, this is a phenomenal panel of people. And Louise and I were just joking. It's good to have the white men at the end of the table. That's where we belong.
We did it on purpose. We were trying to go for an all-female panel, but given institutional hierarchies still exist, we couldn't get rid of them. I want to pivot to you, Vuiseka, because I think this whole question of spending, of being smarter about money is a very important one. And the point that Mark makes about not doing what we've always done because the context has changed is particularly important, I think, for community-based organizations and for social movements. So given your experience with Treatment Action Campaign and given what you've seen, a shift from a real denialist stance in our government to a government now that acknowledges the problem, invests significantly in the problem, and yet we're still seeing significant challenges with people getting the support, services, and dignity that they need. So what is it that community-based and civil society organizations in a context like South Africa, which is in many ways a best-case scenario, what is it that institutions like that can do to be smarter about the money and to have more effective impact that's going to make a difference for women and girls?
Firstly, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of state resources that is leaking out of the state that is meant to be supporting this kind of work that we are doing that goes through out of the door through corruption. That's the starting point. That there are resources, but it's just that the resources are leaking out of the system. And barely the institutions, particularly civil society, that are holding the state to account are diminishing because they don't have the resources to sustain themselves and the pressure that they should have to hold the state to account. So that's the starting point. But I think we also, as in South Africa, we have to acknowledge that as much as, yes, I agree, that we have to saturate our interventions and our support to where it's needed, high-risk women. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that it's also not going to be a silver bullet, because we're talking about poor women who are living in poor communities, who live with sick parents, who live, with no bread at home. So just one intervention or two interventions is just never going to be enough. So it goes back to the point that as we are talking about HIV in this day and era, we cannot, even as movements ourselves, we're struggling from how do you move away from verticalized mobilization that we need to tend to broaden up a bit our approaches, especially when we're talking about addressing the issue of young women and girls, because it's not just the vagina. As Francois has said, it's not just about that. It's also about relationships. It's also about school. It's also about the social environment where the girls live. So we as civil society have a challenge in broadening our scope, but at the same time, we all are struggling to survive. Who is going to be here in 2 years, 3 years? Everyone is lining up behind Deborah because of these dreams. Because everyone thinks that, dreams is just going to be here for the long, but we need to be investing in supporting our state and keeping the money within the state so that when dreams leaves, we have some sustainability for the programs that works, and civil society that does work, that they are able to continue to do that work. It's not just, an international donor coming to South Africa. It's about South Africa doing what it needs to do for South Africans, particularly the state. It's the state role. But I'm definitely not saying there is no role for global solidarity. Please hear me correctly. There is a role, but we have been in a position where in some countries, there have been high dependence on external donors to a point where the state is getting away with murder. And I think with the case of young women, it has gotten away with murder for a long time. And it's about time that all of us as civil society unite and say, you cannot fund HIV if you are not funding young women and girls. And you cannot fund any civil society organizations if it does not deal with gender equality and gender-based violence. Because you cannot separate HIV from gender-based violence. So I think it's also high time that we also have to own up to our own lack of intersectionality in approaching especially young women and boys. And I want to emphasize boys in this context because it's not just the women, it's not just the girls, there is a relational issue we have to accept. And many of us in the women's organizations, we don't want to go there. We don't want to go there because obviously we are worried that, patriarchy is just going to emerge and the boys takes over and we forget about the girls. It's a real threat. But at the same time, it's not a threat to a point where we are not alive to the fact that we cannot leave the boys out of the equation. Less than 34% of men have access to ARVs in South Africa. It's criminal. Where are they? Because of patriarchy. Patriarchy is keeping them at home and they are dying silently at home. And some of them, through the relations, some of them are exposing young women to HIV. We have to acknowledge those intersectionalities. And I think it's high time that we broaden, including donors, we broaden our scope, we broaden our politics, and come together and hold the state to account for the lack of prioritization of young women. Young women only recently have become a key population in South Africa.
I want to bring it back to Ambassador Birks because I want to ask this question about accountability. So there's huge amounts of investment in data, in monitoring and evaluation, and everyone talks this language of accountability. So we're held to a very high standard as civil society organizations and as recipient governments. What about the question of funder accountability? In the sense of I guess I'm asking it in two levels. One is really about the extent to which country partners can ask for a certain amount of accountability in the kinds of conversations you have with our national agencies, right? The kind of access that a PEPFAR has to a South African government is far greater than that kind of access that civil society organizations have. So when we talk the language of partnerships, often we expect a lot of civil society, but we're not sure that we always get the same kind of, from you all. So that's one level. So let me ask that question and then I'll follow up.
Great question. Because, when you're running fast and you're putting out a lot of money, you don't always step back to see who you're talking to. And I think when we started talking about country ownership, it looked very much like country ownership was only at the government level. And I think we have really, and we're not where we need to be, but over the last 2 years, we have really tried to, in every country, during every discussion, ensure that the community is there. Is that perfect? No. But we had a set of really phenomenal, what we call our country operational plan reviews recently, and to have the government, to have the Global Fund, WHO, UNAIDS, and community side by side at the table for 18-hour days to design the best country plan that they could to have the maximum impact, where everybody's voice at the table was equal. And no one we didn't know who was who, because it was very just open to that discussion. Our plans are so much better and so much more impactful. And I think that was a great lesson to us, but also a really great lesson in the country. Because some of our teams have done that extraordinarily well, and some of our teams are still learning how to do it well. But we have to remember one thing, a lot of the people who have come into HIV now didn't start out in HIV then, where there wasn't biomedical anything. There was a community in 1981 that was dying and stood up while they were dying to demand something better for the other people. That is amazing. That never happens in advocacy around a disease, that someone who is that sick stands up and say, we need this for the next person. It's not going to help me. And I think that kind of compassion and humanity, we have to remember that's where we started, and that's where we need to go again. And I agree with you so much about holding departments of education accountable. How many girls are in primary school? How many days are they in school? What are their grades? Do they have mentorship? Are they in secondary school? These are issues that are critical to the HIV plan, but we haven't always been getting them to the table, and that's our fault. So part of this is on our way of doing business, and we're trying to change that.
So Nduku, I have a soft spot for Kenya for lots of reasons. And one of the things that's interesting about Kenya is that you have a highly educated population. There's a relative elite, yeah? Kenya has been a country with a fairly large private sector for quite a long time, good elite that's in place, that runs things quite well. And often, I think, as Africans, we pay far too much attention to donors. So we recognize we need them, we need the money, But the reality is, when you have a caliber of educated people, like you do in a country like Kenya, where people are relatively young and running things in the state, can you talk us through a little bit what levels of accountability there are there for having difficult conversations between different government stakeholders, with or without the presence of funders? Because that's what NAC essentially exists to do, and how difficult or easy it is to push an agenda like young women's vulnerability, comprehensive sexuality education, all of these structural questions that we're talking about.
Thanks. You seem to be throwing the hardest questions my way. But
Do you want mine?
I think, Songe, you're right in the sense that we've taken it upon our business. Let me give the example of Kenya and what we've been doing with regard to getting other government agencies involved. So the government runs on a performance contracting system. So every agency must report, and we get rated. And it's become very robust in the last 3 or 4 years. And HIV is an indicator in that system. So what we have done is gone back and revised the whole system so that all the agencies, or rather the different sectors, have very specific, not only targets, but indicators that they report to. And we've been actually putting our national report cards on our website, which is available for the public domain. That's nac@or.ke. But the question around being able to hold accountable, it is made possible because there's a system for us to do that. And as you know, all governments work through systems. Think even anyone sitting here who works within a government or a huge infrastructure works through systems. And so that particular indicator is what allows us to be able to engage the different ministries and be able to hold them to account, and particularly for the very specific things that they are responsible for. But let me answer, sort of also say that having an agency of government that is working on some of these issues does help interject and engage with other government agencies. And insofar as accountability with regard to donors is concerned, it's something that we have also started to ask of donors, so that we are saying we have national systems, particularly 3 types of things. 1 is national targets, 2 is national commodity and supply chain management systems, and 3 is national data reporting mechanisms. And we are saying we want everyone to use those systems, and if you need additional information, you can collect it, but it's a primary national system that is being utilized, and requiring, asking donors that becomes part of what they do. It will do 3 things. It will enhance efficiency significantly because of how much we spend on many different parallel systems. 2, it will all give us sight into what everybody is doing at the same time. And number 3, and importantly, coming back to the question of young girls, it allows us to be able to collect the data that right now, as we are talking, we actually do not have. We may have the data that was presented in Caprisa, but for most countries, when you ask, what is the number of orphans and vulnerable children that you have that are, in various counties, for instance, and how does that speak to the HIV response? Most people don't have that data. And so how can you intervene on those structural engagements when you don't even know the kind of figures and numbers you're talking about and be able to put that? And that's what we've been able to try and do. And it's taken time because systems take time to deliver. But within this year, we are beginning to feel like more we have the baseline systems. Now it is about actually starting to make them work. So within the next 1-2 years, we'll have a pretty much better picture of where our structural issues sit with regard to the need and, importantly, to the gap, but also what we can demand of other sectors of government.
Thank you. It's like you planned for the question. I want to ask Louise a question about, many of us have had this very robust and honest relationship with UNAIDS for many years. And UNAIDS was the organization that was the scrappy champion for human rights, stigma, discrimination, civil society. So all of the difficult issues, you could put those on the table, and UNAIDS was the kind of smallest guy in the room with the big guys who would then raise those questions. And with the recent round of funding cuts, and we see what's happening with UNAIDS, how worried should those of us in civil society who care about these questions of women's rights, of human rights, be about the effect that this is going to have on this particular kind of agenda? Yeah.
Thanks for the question. I think this should be a point for debate. I agree with you. Recently, at the board meeting in UNAIDS in Geneva, I closed a thematic session on communities, and a whole day that we spent, Ambassador Birks was there, and how we can drive the agenda towards community and with communities in a more systematic way. And my point was to try to say that that belongs to the same track. What we are seeing today in terms of a funding crisis towards civil society and communities is the same crisis that is hitting UNAIDS in some way. We have, at least regarding the AIDS epidemic, we are starting to hit a paradox. What's the shape of the epidemic today? I think it's very easy to describe. Deaths are going down. Infections are going up. We're stable at the best. Stable is not good enough. Stable means that has the risk of going up. That's the paradox that we are starting to hitting now. What show very clear that if you take only one track, If you leave behind the upstream drivers of HIV, we are not going to get in there. That's the global picture today. That is not, that's to me is the big dilemma to be resolved in Durban. How we fix it? Where science is bringing us very far, we are bringing this down. Does not mean that we are impact on the upstream drivers. If we do leave that behind, if we leave rights behind, if we leave communities behind, if we leave the essential aspect of the activism to continue to push the AIDS response forward, we are going to see what start to happen. AIDS is rebound. He is emerging as we are speaking. You are absolutely right. That's the core of the UNAIDS work. The core of your work is on promoting rights, in speak for the voiceless, bring people to the center, and promote communities as the way out of this epidemic. This is what the UNAIDS is primarily about. Yes, UNAIDS is being defunded the same way that communities, civil society are being defunded today.
I want to come back to the Global Fund, and if PEPFAR is Madame Moneybags, seen as, if we're going to speak crudely, PEPFAR has lots of money. UNAIDS sort of carries the flag around the rights questions. Global Fund is a financing mechanism, but it has the countries. You know, it carries the countries. And so given this question about young women and HIV, and the fact that we're still not over that curve, and that you sit with a mandate to really work in countries, what is it that the Secretariat and the people in country working with the Global Fund, what can they add to this mix? What's the sort of strategic value piece about convincing countries not just to put in proposals around treatment?
Thank you. I think the secret is we have a new strategy, and the title of the strategy is Invest to End Epidemics. And that for me is key. We are investors, we work with countries, we work with many stakeholders at country levels, and we really collectively want to end this epidemic. And I think we've been, for the last couple of years, we've told each other that we have the tools to end the epidemic. And I think we've now come to the realization that we have all these beautiful tools, but unless we address the root causes of the epidemic, all the beautiful tools are not getting us there. So I really feel this is a turning point. These are the sort of conversations we have at country level. I see much greater openness at country levels now. I've been going to AIDS conferences since Barcelona 2002, and I've been frustrated at every conference that gender and sexual reproductive health and rights were topics that were discussed in the margins of the conference. It's front and central in every discussion in this conference. Things are changing. We had the high-level meeting on AIDS in June in New York last month. There were many flaws in the political declaration, but there was ambitious language on adolescent girls and young women. And I've been part of many of these political negotiations in New York, and believe me, getting ambitious language in a political declaration is a major achievement. So I think collectively, we are at a turning point where collectively people are realizing that unless we address root causes, unless we address gender equality, we're not getting to the end of AIDS, and we're all part of that. And so there's much greater openness to have those discussions at country level.
Ambassador Birks, let's talk about PrEP. So in this province, in KwaZulu-Natal, it is virtually impossible to get school administrators to even talk about condoms, let alone help to distribute them, when we know that adolescents are having sex. We've seen the data, so it's happening. So it's difficult to even broach the subject of condom distribution. And so now we talk about PrEP, which is a significant leap. So can we talk a little bit about dreams and PrEP and the balance of investment in that strategy vis-a-vis the other kind of long-term structural questions that we've all agreed, the gender norm stuff?
Well, that was what was so great about that last session, because there's been this sense over the last 3 or 4 years with the scientific pieces that keep coming out that's, shows a different efficacy in young women under 25. And I think what we heard was that there may be these super susceptible and super metabolizing women that have a different pH in their vagina.
Yep.
Connected to a human body, but a different pH in their the vagina, that we really perhaps have not been interpreting the data correctly about efficacy and the potential for efficacy and the issue of compliance. So I think that has put a kind of a gray cloud over PrEP for young women because of that issue. And I think you have Linda Gale Becker, who's been speaking out about this and how when a young woman is told this will work, there's a different response, and that makes total sense to me. So we have PrEP and DREAMS in 5 of the countries, and are working with getting that data so that other countries can see it, share it, and see the impact that it's having. But again, we don't want to do PrEP without condoms, without sexuality education.
Yeah.
You know, we don't want to continue that we're doing this but not this, because we know that this without that is not going to work. And I just really want to, we have PrEP because of the private sector partnership of DREAMS with Gilead, Johnson & Johnson, and ViiV Healthcare with Gilead donating the PrEP drug. So this has really been helpful to have the private sector engaged in DREAMS, because the other partners, the founding partners, Bill and Melinda Gates and Girl Effects, are really, particularly Girl Effects, working on changing the brand perception of young women, because they came from Nike. That obviously got a lot of people to buy Nike. So how do we get a brand of young women that the community values? And how do we use that to try to change some of the viewpoints of individuals? But I do come back to, we have to have government as a partner at the ministry level. To really work with us about the school systems. You're very fortunate in South Africa, but there are many countries to the north of you that don't have secondary school for young women. And indeed, by what we would call grade 6, half the women are gone, half the young girls.
Yeah. And of course, in South Africa, very significant issues of quality, very significant issues of the number of all children who start in the system are not making it through at all, despite heavy investments. So I think there's a different conversation that many of us on the civil society side have been talking about in the last few days that we need to have, which is about what you do when you have a government system where you can't get any traction, where it's just really hard because your counterparts, there's little leadership of any kind, whether it's moral, political, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a different conversation that we need to have without you people in the room. Nduku, I see you're interested in a comment, and then we're going to have to start rounding it up. Yes.
Thanks. I was going to say something, but let me just say on what you've said about government. And I think, let me start by saying that many of the governments have, there's been a rollback on the national AIDS commissions. And yet, in many ways, they were the entry to community and to the voice of communities. And so I think that needs to be safeguarded if we're going to continue to have that voice. I was just going to talk about condoms and just say that perhaps we need to rethink prevention and how we are doing prevention. Prevention is currently a little bit of a project here, a project there, and that's problematic. Until we start to have a consistency and be able to say, if it is something like a product, and we are talking about condoms, how many do we need in the country? Are we capturing data on maybe not utilization, but on distribution? Are we captured? The providers who go and talk about condoms, the healthcare workers, the social workers who are doing social health services, they are not healthcare workers, but they're social service staff. Are they going out there and talking about health and talking about reproductive health and talking about, until we start to have that, and therefore we make some of those prevention interventions a core part of programming rather than something we do haphazardly, we will not change the direction that we are going towards with HIV prevention.
Thanks, Nduku. Françoise, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, related to that, I do think that the question of what's going on in health clinics with adolescent girls really needs to be flagged, because the biomedical interventions that were discussed in the previous sessions can be incredibly important as an added piece to the puzzle. But to your point, when we know that adolescent girls coming to sexual and reproductive health clinics get driven out and shamed because they're not supposed to be sexually active, well, we can see that they definitely are. That is going on everywhere, not only in South Africa, but it's going on in a lot of the countries that we're concerned with. And until we really link girls to health clinics that will welcome them and acknowledge that they're sexually active and not judge them and not say, but you know, you're not married, etc., you're below 16. And unless we get to that, we're not going to have the results we need. And that's the big pieces, you know, and I really welcome the conversation about let's not focus on a silver bullet. Let's look at systemic interventions like comprehensive sexuality education, like really making health clinics girl-friendly. And these need to involve the government and need to involve civil society in a big project that is systemic and it involves multiple sectors. You know, there's no silver bullet. It's going to require all of those pieces. And I hope we can take a holistic approach as we look at adolescent girls, because there's not a pill or a single intervention we need. And that's where a funder like the Global Fund can be so helpful, because they engage government by definition in the conversation about systemic approaches.
I think it's time to start wrapping the conversation up. I wanted to give a remark to everyone coming down this way, and then I'll round it up and say thank you to everyone for their participation.
Wow. Then off the top of my head, I really hope Durban 2000 was the start of the access to treatment movement. I really hope that Durban 2016 will be the start of the movement for gender equality and empowerment.
Thanks. Great moderation. Really a conversation. What's difficult to get. I was asked by my colleagues, we are publishing a guideline on HIV prevention, exactly among adolescent girls and young women, but we do need to go beyond. The evidence is clear. The paradox, we are hitting a paradox. I want to repeat that. We do need to change the way that we are working. Two messages that I'd like you to bring back from here. It's urgent. It's absolutely urgent. There is no time to waste. Our timelines, they don't take us more than 2020. We have all the evidence to say we have less than 5 years to turn this epidemic. If not, we are not going to get in there. Business, the way that we are doing, it's not working. The face of the epidemic today is the clear evidence that we are missing something big. And to repeat again and again, we are missing on gender inequality and not tackle that as a major determinant of AIDS, and we are missing on the rights agenda. We need to fix that. There are ways to be systematic, not to be rhetorical, to apply that to save lives and reduce the number of infections. But this is absolutely urgent. I share with my colleague from the Global Fund the expectation in terms of doing that again. We are going to break the silence just in a new direction now. And if we don't do so, we will not have too many conferences to come to do. Thanks.
I'll make two last comments. The first is there is no one single approach that will get us where we need. But importantly, we have to start breaking all those big ideas. We must change gender norms into actionable items, and they must be measured. The second is we must start to invest in prevention with systems for HIV prevention. We are doing prevention ad hoc. We are not putting money in systems, and that means money in government to be able to continue even when we do not have resources, so that prevention is not an ad hoc, but a part of how we do business.
I love this panel. You're all so brief and focused and impactful. It's really, and great questions. So Yeah. Well, that could be why. I just want to start by, I think your questions really pointed out how important that continued dialogue is. And I know this is a week out of our life, but I just want to recognize the leadership in country begins with the ambassador we have. Ambassador Gaspard here has been working very hard on dreams. But with him are our agencies, USAID, CDC, DOD, and Peace Corps, and now Treasury, who are really working as a team with not only the government, but with community. And I think please continue to give them feedback, because in the end, we want to be impactful. We want, as much as you all, to end this epidemic as we know it. And when we talk about gender equality and gender-based violence, I just want to take us back to last evening when Olive was up there with Chris and said, let's not use this topic to divide us. Let's use this topic to bring us together, because we know key populations have terrible issues of injustice, human rights violations, and violence, just like young women, and we're stronger together.
One thought I have is about who's at the table. You know, I do feel it's a turning point in the conversation in the AIDS movement. I've been in these circles for a long time, and I really finally see this conversation about gender equality and adolescent girls taking flight, and it's wonderful and very exciting. But in cases, for example, where we're talking about the Global Fund and the agenda is country-driven, and as it should be everywhere, who is at the table to make the case, and whose imagination, whose knowledge is brought to bear, are really questions that we have to contemplate. And there's data, and that's very important in all this evidence, and there's also community knowledge about what is likely to work and what we should try, and the analysis of the problem that comes from communities. And women's groups have been jumping up and down saying, adolescent girls for about 15 years now, and it took that long to be heard. But we're very stubborn, so we're still here saying it. Yeah, thank you. But now that we finally are getting through, we need to be at the table as the programs are developed, they're proposed, and they're implemented. So do remember who's been saying this all this time. We need to have women's organizations very much at the table at country level to really push this agenda so that we can finally have the world we want for our girls.
My comment is, for the HIV to turn around treatment, it was not only the scientists and the politicians, it was the people. Let's not forget that the people will turn this tide around, especially for young women and girls. Let's go back and not speak to the wrong people. We spend too much time speaking to politicians and ourselves, and we're not spending enough time speaking to the real people on the ground, women who have been organizing, old grannies who have been taking care of young girls who are living with HIV, who know, and they are the data, and they know what, from their own experiences, what works and what doesn't work. Let's not undermine their experience.
Thanks everyone for coming to this session. It's been important, lively, engaging. I won't summarize. I'll say two things that I think are really crucially important. One is to remember, one of the key takeaway messages here is that we've got to do it all, and that ambition is key when we're talking about young women and girls. For too long we've done so little that now we really have to make up for that with increased ambition rather than less, despite our context. I think the other point is we have to put power at the center of our conversations. Power, not just programs, right? We need the programs, but the programs must be based on this notion that we understand what the power differentials are and what a difference they make in girls' ability to prevent HIV downstream, not so late that we're talking about the vaginas, well before we get to the vaginas. There is a petition that some young people from Section 27 have, which, and they're waving their hand over there. It's about these very, very same issues, so please go and sign the petition. It's to get condoms and sanitary pads available and accessible to young people in schools in this country. So please sign and add your voice, not just listen and clap. Thank you very much, everyone.